Hello there. In this video of our writing process series, we'll be talking about the differences between quoting versus paraphrasing. To put it in the simplest terms possible, quoting is just taking information word for word from one of your sources, whereas paraphrasing is putting that same information into your own words. That sounds very simple, but of course, it's never quite that simple when you're actually putting it into practice. So let's get into it. I just so happen to be filming this on Valentine's Day, so let me put it to you this way. If you were writing someone a love letter, you would want most of that to be expressed in your own words because you want to show that there's authenticity there and that you understand what you're saying to this person and actually mean it. That doesn't mean, however, that you can't take a line of poetry or a line from a song and incorporate that into your letter because that line is particularly beautiful and expresses something fitting that nobody else could have expressed that way. As long as you're not kind of swiping the whole poem and going, here, the Happy Valentine's Day, it should be all right. And as long as the person that you are writing this to understands that that's a little piece that you took from somewhere to be representative, rather than kind of trying to pass it off as your own. And it's similar when you're trying to incorporate research into your paper. You want to be really choosy about when you quote something word for word, and most of it should be expressed in your own words. Now, there are, as with anything, exceptions to this. So, for instance, if you are writing a paper in which you're analyzing literature, then a lot of that is going to be quoted from the literature because you're trying to analyze the precise words that are in the author's writing. So your reader would need to see those words. But with those exceptions aside, in most of your academic writing, how are you going to decide whether to quote something versus whether to paraphrase something? Most of the time, you want to quote something when what's important about the quote, it's not just what the author is saying there, but how he or she is saying it. If how he or she is saying it makes a difference in what the reader takes from it, then that might be something that you would prefer to quote. Most of what you will be reading from your research is academic writing, and most academic writing is pretty straightforward, to the point, means exactly what it says. So most of it does not fit that category that we're talking about. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of what I mean when I say something you might want to quote versus something that you might as well just paraphrase. To quote or to paraphrase, that is the question. Let's look at our first quote. Progress has recently been made in the earlier identification of children with autism spectrum disorder. While this may be perfectly good information for our paper, there's nothing about this quote that is poetic or that is kind of special in any way. And if I were to rephrase it and put it in my own words, it wouldn't lose any of its meaning or impact. So there's really no reason for me to quote this word for word. I could simply restate it my own way. Autism spectrum disorder can now be detected earlier than before. Just kind of give the reader the gist of what the original said. Here's our next one. Let's say that you're a reporter in the 1960s and you attended Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech, and now you're reporting on that for your newspaper. You could simply paraphrase what MLK said that day and say something like, in his speech, Martin Luther King spoke passionately about his vision that all Americans see one another as equals regardless of race. And you would be fairly accurately representing one of the messages he was trying to get across. But you would pack much more of a punch if you used his actual wording. In his speech, Martin Luther King proclaimed, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And the reason that this is much more impactful is because while what he was saying was very important, it's also how he was saying it that made it memorable. So if you remove the wording, then you've actually, to some degree, removed a little bit of its meaning and of its power. Now, are you likely to find language that poetic in your average academic article? No, but that doesn't mean that there's never anything worthy of being quoted. Let's take a look at this example in which I paraphrase most of it, but there is a particular phrase that I left in quotation marks. In an article released in March 2020, the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when much of the world was first under lockdown orders, Fauci et al. Explained that scientists were navigating the uncharted. So while this is basically informative, telling us that scientists at this time were dealing with something very new and kind of figuring things out as they went along, it's also painting a picture in the mind of the reader. And the only part that's really doing that is this phrase, navigating the uncharted. So that's the only part that I put in quotation marks. And by the way, that is something you could do. A sentence in your paper could be sort of half quoted, half paraphrased. There's no reason that you can't kind of play with that combination. So now you know that you are going to be paraphrasing most things. And you're like, okay, cool. Just put it in my own words. That doesn't sound too complicated. But actually, it's easier said than done because it's quite difficult for your brain to find a new way to say something that it just read. So you have to actually actively work to make a paraphrase a true paraphrase rather than just kind of like a copy paste where you replaced a few words in the sentence with synonyms and maybe you took out a little piece. That doesn't suddenly make it a paraphrase. So in order to make sure that you have a true paraphrase, there's a few key steps that you want to follow. Number one is take the original sentence or passage and read it really carefully and read it probably multiple times. You want to read it enough where you feel like you could meet someone tomorrow and explain to them what you read. At that point, there's no way that you're going to be saying it the exact same way that it was written, but that doesn't mean you're not saying the same thing, right? So once you reach a level of understanding where you could kind of like teach what you just read to somebody, then you're ready to paraphrase it. Then step two is to paraphrase it while not looking back at the original. It's going to be too much of a temptation to use a lot of the same language or to use the same sort of sentence structure if you are still looking at the original sentence or passage while you are paraphrasing it. Then step three, when you're done paraphrasing, sure, go back and read the original just to make sure that you didn't kind of misrepresent anything. And if you feel like your sentence doesn't sound that sophisticated, you're welcome to later on in the revision process make that sentence sound better, but you're working with your own sentence. You no longer even remember the original quote. So make sure to follow those steps. Even though it sounds easy to say, put it in your own words, it takes some time and effort and some practice over time to get really good at that. One thing that can help to make this a little bit easier is to remember that you don't necessarily have to have a one sentence to one sentence equivalence when you're paraphrasing, meaning that you don't necessarily have to look at your article and pick out a one sentence quote that you're going to turn into a one sentence paraphrase. You could look at a passage that has multiple sentences in it, or even an entire paragraph, and then decide that you are going to give your reader the gist of what that paragraph said in one sentence in your paper. And that makes it much easier to paraphrase naturally without always feeling tempted to use the wording from the original because they had multiple sentences and you are just writing one. That doesn't mean you're always going to do that. Sometimes you will have just one sentence that you're turning into a paraphrase, but keep in mind that that doesn't have to be the case every single time.